Hey guys, it's Randy with Lowbuck LS here again, and in this episode I'm going to show you how to convert your intake air temperature sensor from the factory one, which is a combination sensor. Your intake air temperature is built in with your mass airflow sensor, but I don't have room for that in my setup, so I'm going to convert to a standalone intake air temperature sensor. So I'll flip the camera around and we'll get started. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so like I said, from the factory, this truck comes with this is the mass airflow sensor, and your intake air temperature sensor, I believe, is that little black nubbin there that sticks into the tube here. So that works great on the stock intake, but the problem I've got is I'm short of room here. I could put it there, but then I'd need an extra coupling in between my throttle body, and I'm gonna be putting this intercooler, like it's basically gonna come out of this. This is like a 3 3/4 by 3 inch reducing coupling, and it's gonna go right into this 3-inch elbow into this intercooler. So the intercooler is basically gonna be hanging down right here. So basically I don't have room for this sensor in there anymore, and I actually don't need the mass airflow part of it because I've converted my truck to that 3-bar enhanced operating system in HP tuners. So what I'm going to do instead, I've got this sensor, ordered it from Summit Racing. It is a fast part number 307004, and I've got this 3/8 NPT steel bung, Canton Racing 20-883, and then I've got a little pigtail that connects into that. It's an ICT billet 551209, and there's the little pigtail that plugs into this sensor. So, oops, dropping stuff on the ground. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut a piece of 3-inch exhaust tubing that's going to connect that 3-inch silicone elbow, which is going to be on the top of my intercooler, to that coupling, which is attached to the throttle body. And then I'm going to drill whatever size hole I need and weld this 3/8 MPT steel bung into that coupling or connecting piece of pipe there. So we'll get started with that. Alright, so I got a piece of 3-inch exhaust pipe, 5.5 inches long, that I cut, and I've marked the center of it, and I'm going to use this step bit to drill a hole that's big enough to basically the hole will be just smaller than the outside diameter of this 3/8 bung, and then we'll get that bung welded on there. So this intake air temperature sensor will it should just stick into the pipe a little bit. So we'll get that hole drilled and get that bung welded on. Okay, so I got that 3/8 NPT pipe bung welded on in the middle of this 5.5 inch long section of 3-inch exhaust pipe. So now I'm gonna basically put that in there, like put it so the side that I welded better is facing up. So basically that's gonna sit in there like that, and then that 3-inch elbow going into the intercooler is gonna slide on right there. So yeah, we'll get that put together, and then get this or wherever I put that fast intake air temp sensor, we'll get threaded into there, and then we'll get the wiring figured out. Okay, so we got that 3-inch piece of pipe with our 3/8 NPT bung in there, Got our intercooler kind of hanging in there. I'm gonna have to figure out some way of supporting it here, because right now it's just kind of dangling and it's basically pulling down on this whole assembly here and making that coupler bend there. So but I don't have the couplings here to finish the connection from the intercooler to the turbo, so basically that's as far as we're going to be able to go on that. But I'm going to work on, we'll put that standalone IAT sensor in there, and then before I go ahead and cut this connector off, I want to fire up HP tuners and compare the readings just to make sure the calibration is the same. So we'll see what this thing is reading for IAT on HP tuners, and then we'll hook up the other probe and see what that one is reading. Okay, so I found an old adapter here, so I've got it rigged up so I can fire up the engine, and right now it'll read off the original mass airflow / IAT sensor. So we'll see what we're reading for IAT there, and then we'll hook it up to the new one here, which you can see I've got installed in that bung there now, and we'll compare the two readings. So we'll get that set up. Okay, so this truck's a little loud when you're standing outside of it, but so we're hooked up reading from the factory MAF IAT sensor, and I don't even know if you guys can hear me, but we're reading 32 degrees Celsius. So now we'll hook up to that other one and see what it reads. Okay, so now we are running again, and I'm hooked up to the new IAT sensor, and once I've got the truck shut off, I'll show you how I hook that up. But I got the scanner going, and we're reading exactly the same as the other one, so that tells me that this the calibration curve or whatever is the same. So now I'll shut the truck off and I'll show you how I wired that up. Okay, to wire up this new sensor, it's got a purple and a brown wire. So basically you got to hook what is the purple wire on the pigtail has to go to this first black wire that's on the very edge of the basically that one I'm touching with my finger right there is what gets connected to the purple wire, and then the one right beside it, that kind of tan color, gets hooked up to the brown wire. So I think now to neaten up my engine compartment, I'm basically going to route this wire back along and maybe even put it underneath this coil pack wiring here, and basically just clean up that wiring, and then we should be good to go on this intake air sensor. So I'll get that wiring hooked up and in place permanently, and then we'll fire the truck up one more time. Okay, I'm going to do some modifications to the wiring on this plug-in for the factory mass airflow / IAT sensor. So the two wires that I'm going to use for that new IAT sensor are, like I said earlier in the video, this looks like a black and a tan or something. So the other three, I'm actually going to cut them back in this black wire loom here, and then I'm going to cut a little piece of heat shrink tubing over each one and just shrink the end to keep them from shorting out against anything. So basically they'll be cut off back inside this black loom where you can't see them. So the only two wires we'll see sticking out are the black and the tan one that we're going to be using for this IAT sensor. Okay, so I've got those three wires I'm not using cut, and then a little piece of black heat shrink sleeve. So I shrink it on there, and then while it's still hot, I just pinch the end shut with my fingers, and that basically will isolate it and keep it from shorting out against the other wires or part of the truck or whatever. So I'm going to tuck those back in to the loom here, and then we'll splice another cable onto these 2 wires that we are using and extend it to reach that new sensor. Okay, so I got those 2 wires we're using cut back so the splice will be in the loom, and then I've extended on a piece of this. It's basically, where I work we call it like a Belden cable, but it's just a red and a black, like 16 or 18 gauge inside a shielded cable there. So I've just got it crimped together. I've got a couple more chunks of heat shrink that I will just slide over to insulate those connections. So I'll heat shrink those and then tuck them back inside the loom, and then I'll route that wiring so it's mostly out of view. Like before it was kind of strung across here, but now I'll run it. I took those coil packs off. I'll run it kind of in where I ran that red wire to tie the O2 sensor into the EGR. So it'll come along this valley here, and I don't know if I'll go underneath or over top of that, probably underneath that rad hose, and get her spliced up. And that is what the connection looks like now that I've got the heat shrink tubing shrunk over those crimps. So I'll tuck that all back into the loom now and run this wire where it needs to go. Alright, so I got that wiring harness kind of ran where it needs to be. So I basically doubled it back. You can see it running back along that, and then it goes down. You can see it's that first black wire loom there, and then it goes underneath in behind the coil packs and comes out right at the front of the engine in kind of a little valley beside the valve cover. So now I've basically just got to splice it up right here, and I'll put heat shrink and stuff over it again to kind of insulate it and make it look as nice as possible, and then we'll fire up the truck and make sure it's working again on HP tuners. Alright, so now I got my wires from the wiring harness crimped onto this pigtail from ICT billet, and now I'm going to slide a piece of heat shrink sleeve over each connection to insulate the wires from each other, and then I'm going to slide a bigger piece over the whole works. So we'll do that now. And there you can see that little heat shrink that I slid over the individual connections. Now I'll slide this big one over top of the whole works and shrink it down. Alright, and there you can see I slid that big piece of heat shrink tube over the whole assembly, and I just coiled up I left a little bit of extra wire there, and it's just coiled up to that hose. That's my vent for the steam lines, and I ran it over top of the radiator hose just to keep it out of the serpentine belt there. So now I'll fire up the truck, and we'll hook up our laptop and make sure it's reading a believable temperature. So it should be cooler than the first part of this video where it was reading 32 degrees Celsius. That was done last night, and it's cooler out today, so I'm expecting a reading, I don't know, somewhere around maybe 20-ish degrees Celsius. So we'll fire that up and see what it reads. Okay, so I got the key turned on, got my laptop hooked up, and the scanner on, and my intake air temperature is showing 23 degrees, which feels about right. So now if I start the truck up and close the hood, we should see that intake air temperature start to rise, because it'll be sucking warm air in from underneath the hood here, so I'll try that experiment next. Okay, so truck is running, as you can hear, obviously, and our intake air reading is coming up. It went from 23 to 26 as things warm up under the hood there, so I'll shut it off and believe that it's working correctly. Alright, and that is how you convert your factory IAT MAF combination sensor to a standalone IAT sensor. So we're gonna wrap things up for this week. Next things going on are I should have parts coming to finish off installing that intercooler and get our charge tube, or cold side I guess, hooked up from the turbo to the throttle body through the intercooler. We're gonna have to rig up some kind of reservoir and pump system because it's an air to water intercooler. I've got a boost gauge to install, and I want to work a little bit more on my startup airflow tuning. So those will all be videos coming up in the next little while here, so stay tuned. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks to all you guys who are watching and commenting and subscribing and all that, and we'll talk to you on the next one.